Hello, everyone. This episode is for the theology nerds. I speak with Roger E. Olson, Professor Emeritus at Baylor University's George Truett Theological Seminary in Texas. Professor Olson has written over 20 books, including Against Calvinism, The Story of Christian Theology, many others. There are very few people alive today who have had personal encounters with Wolfhart Pannenberg, Oral Roberts, Jürgen Moltmann, John Piper, R.C. Sproul, Richard Bauckham, and the list goes on. So if even one or two of those names is recognized by you, you're probably going to enjoy this episode. We talk about how Professor Olson left Pentecostalism, what post-conservative evangelical theology is, and why he refuses to give up the label evangelical. Unfortunately, we had some issue with Professor Olson's camera, so I put in some B-reel if you're watching on YouTube, but I hope you enjoy nonetheless. Thank you, Professor Olson, for speaking with me today. One thing I've always appreciated about your blog and also your books is you're very autobiographical in your writing, which I enjoy. So in that spirit, could I ask you, how did you first become a theologian?
I grew up in a family that was very large, extended family. I had 65 first cousins when they were all alive. And at family reunions, there was a lot of theological discussion among the adults, and I listened in. And I was curious about all of the things they were discussing. And I think that's where it began for me. I also grew up in a Pentecostal minister's home in a Pentecostal church. And I don't think it was what a lot of people imagined that to be. We were pretty interested as a church in doctrine, and we didn't use the word theology for it, but there was a lot of discussion about theological topics in Bible studies and small groups. And so I grew up surrounded by what I call theology. My father had a library at the church that had quite a few theology books, and I read a lot of them. Then I went to a Pentecostal Bible college and found something different there. It wasn't what I expected. A lot of what I was hearing in class from students and somewhat from teachers seemed to me to be just wrong. And so I began to read on my own and talk with my father and other people in the denomination. And I was just really, really perplexed about what I was hearing in the hallways and in the student lounge and even in classes, but especially in chapels. Chapels, I thought, the speakers were heretics. And so I just continued reading, studying, and just got fascinated with theology. Why do we believe what we believe, both as Pentecostals, but just as Christians as well? And just took off, went to seminary, loved theology classes, went on for a degree in religious studies at Rice University, which in America is a pretty well-known major research university in Houston, Texas. And studied with a German theologian in Munich, Germany, named Pannenberg, and went on to teach in 3 different Christian universities, always teaching theology or subjects related to theology, apologetics and ethics especially. So that's it.
Sure.
Check out our other episodes.
Was there a particular book or even a person in those years that really shaped your intellectual journey?
Since I just found out that you're in South Africa, it immediately came to my mind, Adrio Koenig. Do you know who that is?
I've heard the name.
Okay, so there's a South African theologian, he's dead now, named Adrio Koenig. And I loved his books. One was named in English here in the United States by the United States publisher, Erdman's Press. It was called Here I Am, or Here Am I can't remember the exact title, A Believer's Reflections on God, and just an amazing book of theology. I loved it. So Adrio Koenig, Robert Jensen, of course, Karl Barth, Emil Brunner, a lot of theologians that would be categorized as neo-Orthodox, but also evangelical theologians, but more on the progressive side of evangelical theology, especially Donald Blesch, an American evangelical theologian. So yeah, those are some of them.
Yeah, you mentioned studying with Pannenberg, who is, of course, a big name in 20th century theology. What was that experience like?
Well, I got interested in Pannenberg when I was in seminary because I took a course on process theology. It was a seminar taught by a Lutheran theologian who was a process theologian. And I was intrigued, but I didn't like process theology. I was intrigued by the idea of God's becoming.
Hmm.
And so that led me to Jürgen Moltmann and Robert Jensen and Wolfhart Pannenberg, reading them, that is. Later, I got to
Sure.
know all of those, Pannenberg, Jensen, and Moltmann personally. The opportunity arose to go and study with Pannenberg in Munich, and I grabbed the opportunity while I was at Rice University. After I finished my coursework there, Rice University sent me over to Munich to study with him for a year. And
Okay.
I didn't necessarily like him personally. He was
Okay.
very Prussian. I don't know if you know what that means, but very aloof. And yet he took me under his wing. We met many times personally. I was in his home twice.
Hmm.
And he ended up coming to America and was in my home as well. And I got to know him, but he was hard to get to know. He was not a very personable person, and he was not pious at all. He
Okay.
was a high church Lutheran, sacramental, and he often said, "If there is one thing I am not, it is a pietist." Well, I come from a Pentecostal background, so I'm attracted to pietism. I
Sure.
never heard him pray, and he seemed to me to have a very intellectualized Christianity rooted in Hegel. And so
Okay.
I have been a lifelong learner of Hegel. Right now, I'm planning to write a book on Hegel and modern theology.
Very interesting. Yes, you've written a book on pietism as well, isn't that right?
Yes, co authored it, Reclaiming Pietism.
I too am drawn to pietism, so I'm disappointed to hear that Pannenberg said that. How did he compare to Moltmann, like in terms of his personality?
Moltmann was much more engaging. He was shy, and so it was kind of hard to get him into a conversation. But once he had a few glasses of wine, he became very talkative.
Sure, that usually does the trick.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you mentioned you grew up Pentecostal, and I know as well from reading your stuff that you also taught at Oral Roberts University later on. Could you maybe talk a little bit about your assumed exit out of Pentecostalism?
That began while I was in seminary. I was in a Baptist seminary, a broadly Baptist seminary rooted in German pietism, not Southern Baptist or not fundamentalist at all. And I loved it. I absolutely loved my professors and fellow students and just had a wonderful time in contrast to the Pentecostal college. So that really
Okay.
began to show me a way out of Pentecostalism. And the main problem I had with Pentecostalism was anti intellectualism. In contrast to what I said earlier, there was a real limit, though, to how far they would go in discussing theology. At some
Okay.
point, I always ran up against a brick wall with Pentecostals. And suddenly the conversation would turn anti intellectual.
Hmm.
And so I was attracted to theology in seminary. I was reading Emil Brunner in a class on theology, and I really liked it. And it wasn't what I had been told. I had been warned by my Pentecostal brothers and sisters, parents, evangelist pastors against seminary. I went
Yeah.
against their advice, and that began them pushing me out. And at a certain point, I just said, okay, I give up. I'm going to become Baptist. And I did.
Okay.
But I've also been Presbyterian, and now I'm Mennonite.
From my own background of growing up in and around a bit of charismatic circles and being highly formed through, I'm not sure if you've heard of Youth with a Mission, YWAM.
I've been to their European headquarters at Lausanne.
Okay, yes. Yeah, my brother actually did a discipleship school there. Within those sorts of circles, there can be a degree of that anti intellectualism that you described in your background. So, how do you think we can embrace, good thinking and dense theology, like you have exercised, while also being a pious, faithful, warm hearted Christian? Where's the balance, or how do we hold the tension, do you think?
By going against the stream, it's hard. It's been a lifelong struggle for me,
Hmm.
even in more theologically open churches and institutions. I found some degree of resistance to the life of the mind. among
Yeah.
evangelical Christians, but there are exceptions. And so I've been attracted to the exceptions. I became editor of an evangelical scholarly journal called Christian Scholars Review, and found
Okay. Yeah.
places like that to have my conversations about theology with fellow believers. But in
Mm.
most of the churches I've been a part of, the average pew sitters are not very interested in theology. And so it's been a struggle. And I would say it's a struggle for anybody in America anyway, because our culture is so polarized over many, many things: politics, culture, religion. And it seems like
Yeah.
there's not a big group of people here in America that are evangelical in faith and intellectually inclined. There are
Mm.
some, but it's a smaller group than the other. So I've just been swimming against the stream my whole life and gravitating toward people who are like me. And that's been easier because I've been in academic settings. So it's been
Hmm.
easier for me than for a lot of people I know who are in evangelical churches, don't have a degree or don't have a connection to the academy. And so I meet weekly with my pastor. He's a Mennonite pastor, but he's very theological. And so we have good theological discussions weekly, but they don't spill over into the church.
Yeah, that's relatable, but not encouraging.
No, no, I can't be encouraging about it. It seems to me it's gotten worse over my
Okay.
lifetime as far as lay people and many pastors
Yeah.
withdrawing from theological discussion.
Almost 30 years ago, you wrote a book with the late Stanley Grenz, right? Who Needs Theology?
That was our second book. Our first book was 20th Century Theology: God and the World in a Transitional Age. We had already become friends, and then we remained friends and worked closely together on many projects. But those two books we co wrote, but after that, we still worked on things together, such as the Evangelical Theology Group of the American Academy of Religion. We led that.
Okay.
And then he just suddenly died in
Yeah.
2005 at the age of 55, which was devastating to me because he
Mm.
was one of my best friends.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I have his book, Theology for the Community of God, which I found to be a very helpful counter pill to reading Wayne Grudem in my undergrad assignments.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear that. Not so much because you enjoyed Stan's book as that you didn't enjoy Grudem's book.
Yes, much could be said on that topic. But I
Uh-huh.
originally brought up that book, Who Needs Theology, because I'm curious as to what would you say to the maybe even an elder or a ordained pastor leading a church who says, we don't really need to talk about theology. It's just divisive and it's elitist. Let's just do a shallow Bible study or, talk about pragmatic things. How would you respond to that now?
Over the years, I've had so many failures with those kinds of conversations that I just back away from them now
Okay,
because it never
fair.
works to try to counter that. It works with students, and I enjoyed my classes and my students and talking to them about those questions, about the importance of theology. But when
Hmm.
lay people would say things like that to me, I tried many different approaches and answers and didn't really get anywhere. I'll just tell you one quick story to illustrate. I was a member of a Baptist church in Waco, Texas, when I was teaching at Truett Seminary at Baylor University there. And it was, a very intellectually inclined church. Most of the people in the church had graduate degrees. Many of them taught at Baylor University, but there was a deep distrust of theology. One time they decided to create a team, a discernment team, to talk about possibly admitting members who were baptized as infants but not as adults. I asked to be on that team, and they said no. And in my conversations with them, it became clear to me they didn't want a theologian. I would just
That's
complicate the issue as a
sure.
theologian. It wasn't about me personally. That they made clear. They just
Okay.
didn't want a theologian. A Baptist writer, his name escapes me right now, said, "Happy is the Christian who never met a theologian."
It sounds like a missed opportunity, like not calling a plumber when there's a broken
Yeah,
pipe.
well, that's what I said to them a couple different times, and they were very polite about it,
Hmm.
but just said, "No, we don't want you on the team. You would make things difficult." And I
Okay.
found that. I mean, I found that my being on a board or a committee outside the university, of course, was usually more of a problem than a real opportunity.
Hmm.
And that's discouraging, and I'm sorry for that, but that's the way it's been for me. Now, the one exception to that was when I was briefly a Presbyterian. I was
Okay.
on staff of a Presbyterian church while I was working on my doctoral degree at Rice University, and moved around among Presbyterians, even after that, speaking in Presbyterian churches a lot when I was teaching at a Baptist college in Minnesota. And I always
Hmm.
found Presbyterians to be different, very open to intellectual inquiry, to theological discussion. The only problem was they didn't really want to come down on anything definitely. They were interested in
Okay.
discussing theology, but they didn't like anything they perceived as dogmatic. Now,
Hmm.
these were mainline Presbyterians, not the conservative Presbyterians that we have here in the USA, not
Okay.
PCA or something like that. I always found Presbyterians to be more open to theology, but I never
Good.
could be a Presbyterian because I definitely don't believe in infant baptism.
Yes, that's something that I am very much on the fence about. And yeah, I'm currently at an Anglican church, but it's very open-handed Anglican church. They perform both infant baptism and dedication, depending on the parent's preference.
I think that's becoming more common, especially since people are coming to realize that Karl Barth was against infant baptism.
Was he really?
Yes.
Wow.
Well, he said that it's probably too late to undo it now, but he thought it was theologically incorrect.
Okay, well, I'll remember that the next time I'm discussing this with someone. You're known, of course, for, I mean, for several things, but popularly for defending Arminianism. What do people most misunderstand about Arminianism? I know you've written a whole book about that question, but just
Mhm.
briefly, how would you describe the misunderstandings?
Let me put it this way. I think very few people understand it at all because even where they think they understand it, they have it wrong. And that's why I wrote Arminian Theology, Myths and Realities, is not only to correct Calvinists who often go around misrepresenting Arminianism, sometimes when they know better. I've actually had that happen in face-to-face conversations and conferences where Calvinists misrepresented Arminianism, and I knew they knew better.
Hmm.
But most people don't. Whether they're Calvinist or Arminian, they don't know what it really is. And I think real Arminianism is very rare. Now, I grew up Pentecostal, and we were Arminian. I heard that a few times growing up, and in college, I certainly heard it. But now that I look back on it, I don't think it was ever presented correctly.
Okay.
So, for example, just to pick an example, Arminius himself and all true Arminians have always believed that the natural man in his or her sinfulness is incapable of reaching out to God for salvation without the prevenient grace of the Holy Spirit working in them,
Mm-hmm.
overcoming total depravity. Whereas most
Yes.
Arminians have backed away from total depravity entirely. So there's been a maybe overreaction to Calvinism among some Arminians to the point where they're not really Arminian anymore, they're Pelagian. And here in
Okay.
America, I can't speak for other countries, but here in America, Pelagianism is rampant among Christians
Sure.
of all denominations, except the hardcore Calvinist denominations.
Could you just briefly explain that for somebody who might not know what Pelagian is?
So Pelagianism is named after a heretic in the fourth and fifth centuries named Pelagius, who taught that the fall of man in Adam and Eve in the garden did not destroy and did not cause the loss of ability. to want salvation and to ask God for salvation. And he believed and taught that it was possible for someone to go through all of life,
Mm.
even to old age, and not sin without any
Okay.
special help from the Holy Spirit. Well, Augustine, the church father during his time, overreacted to Pelagius by emphasizing total depravity, saying it's not possible not to sin, and then going on to predestination, what we call monergism, that God does everything in salvation, that we do not really have free will.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that debate between Pelagians and Augustinians went on for ages and ages, and just jumping up to today, Pelagianism is sort of the popular view of Americans, and it comes through in a lot of songs that I hear in churches. There's a popular one called, let me think, hey, it's not coming to my mind right now, but it portrays Jesus as standing at the door and knocking, as the picture we've all seen shows. But then it says, if you'll take one step toward the Savior, my friend, you'll find his arms open wide. But it doesn't say anything about how you can take one step to the Savior. It doesn't say anything about needing the prevenient grace of God, whether called that or not. That's not important. It's not the word prevenient that matters. It's
Sure.
the idea that through the preaching of the gospel, Arminius believed, the Holy Spirit gives people the ability that they don't have otherwise to accept God's forgiveness and
Mm-hmm.
regenerating power. So I think that's the real big problem, is that teaching of Arminianism, true Arminianism, has been lost by and large.
Yeah.
And so Calvinists here in the United States frequently refer to Arminianism as Pelagianism or semi-Pelagianism. And I wrote the
Mm-hmm.
book to correct that. And I sent
Okay.
it to leading Calvinists like R.C. Sproul, John Piper, and others, and never heard back from them.
Okay.
And asked them to
That's
read
too
it
bad.
and to respond, and they didn't.
Yeah, I've been reading your book. When you confirmed that you could do this interview, I wanted to read one of your books, so I picked up Against Calvinism, which I haven't read before, and I've been impressed by how you really go to their books and their sources and really try to fairly represent their view before, I guess, disagreeing with it. Do you think, in light of the young restless reform movement, kind of mostly being a thing of the past, right? That momentum is kind of slowed down, I would say. Does that debate still matter today?
We don't hear about it as much. So, like most movements, it kind of ceased as a movement, but filtered into the churches. And
Hmm.
virtually all denominations of evangelical Christians have been touched by it. And
Yeah.
so it's not a movement anymore as much as just part and parcel of the fabric of American religion.
Hmm. So, in that sense, perhaps maybe providing an alternative to the heresy of Pelagianism and the perhaps misguided hardcore Calvinism is more important than ever.
That's what I thought and still think. I try to do it on my blog from time to time, not necessarily as often as I used to. But for example, just to answer your question of what's happened to it, the other day I was talking to my pastor, who is a bishop in the Mennonite church that our congregation belongs to, the Lancaster Mennonite Conference. And we were talking about other Mennonite churches in our conference. And he told me that the one nearest to us here in Colorado, the pastor is a Calvinist. Well,
Okay.
Calvinism is completely foreign to Anabaptist tradition and theology. So,
Hmm.
how could that happen? Well, I'm sure that he was touched in college or seminary by the Young Restless Reform movement. I don't know him personally, but I'm guessing he read John Piper, like almost all of them did, but remained Mennonite. And somehow these denominations, even Pentecostal ones, the largest Assembly of God church in America, was pastored by a Calvinist. Now, it just withdrew from the Assemblies of God, but it was in Springfield, Illinois, and the pastor was a Calvinist, and it still is. But the denominational leaders, I don't know why, just didn't crack down on it when Calvinism is completely contrary to those denominations' traditions and beliefs. But that's because of the young restless reform movement. It created a situation where many young up and coming pastors became Calvinists and stayed with their denominations that were not at all Calvinist.
Hmm.
So that's the situation now.
That is really interesting. As you were speaking, I was thinking of perhaps in the last decade or so, it seems that more and more people are maybe leaving kind of a bland evangelicalism and finding the historical roots of whatever Roman Catholicism or Anglo Catholic or becoming Orthodox. What do you think of that movement of people moving towards those more traditional uh, traditions? Like, why are people doing that, do you think?
Well, it's not a new thing, really. I've lived long enough to see a lot of these things in their roots, their beginnings. And long ago, I'd say in the 1960s, 70s, there was a professor at Wheaton College named, I believe it was Robert Weber,
Oh, yes.
and
Yeah.
he was Episcopalian. And he wrote several books urging evangelical Christians to look back to the ancient roots of Christianity, to the church fathers, and to walk what he called the Canterbury Trail to the
Hmm.
Episcopal Church. And many did. And some of those became leaders among evangelicals in America. And there was a time when the editor of Christianity Today was an Episcopalian, and he had grown up Seventh-day Adventist. So that
Okay.
was kind of prior to the Young Restless Reform movement. There was this movement among young evangelicals toward liturgical churches.
Hmm.
Now, yes, some became Catholic, and I remember there was a professor at Gordon Conwell Seminary, or maybe it was Gordon College. They were related somehow. Tom Howard, who wrote a book about becoming Catholic, and
Okay.
there was this movement that I guess still has its effects among evangelicals here in America, anyway. I don't know about the rest of the world, where many
Hmm.
evangelical young people who feel like they grew up without any form or tradition, and they felt like their churches were just kind of making up Christianity as they went along, uh, reached out for roots and found roots, or they believe they did, in liturgical traditions. And I've never felt that attraction. I tell people I grew up Pentecostal, and Baptist is as high church as I can get.
That's
So
funny.
I pastor twice a month a Baptist church that has a divided chancel, which is very unusual. But there even are some Baptist churches that are liturgical, and it's
Okay.
mildly liturgical compared to other Baptist churches.
Sure.
And I enjoy it, but I don't really feel any strong pull in that direction.
Hmm. That leads me to another question I wanted to ask you. What's something that you've changed your mind about over the years?
The biggest change probably was about speaking in tongues. And when I was still Pentecostal, while I was in a Pentecostal Bible college, I came to the difficult conclusion that speaking in tongues is not the sine qua non, the physical evidence of the infilling of the Holy Spirit.
Hmm.
And once I began to let that be known and challenge my professors and leaders of the denomination, my uncle was the president of the denomination, and ask them where it is in the Bible, they really couldn't answer. They
Yeah.
thought they were answering by talking about a pattern in the book of Acts, but
Hmm.
that didn't convince me that it should be a doctrine. Well, that led to me being pushed out of Pentecostalism. And that was okay. I'm glad that happened.
Hmm.
But then I went on eventually to teach at Oral Roberts University. But what a lot of people don't understand is that Oral Roberts was not Pentecostal then when I taught at Oral Roberts University. He was United Methodist, and he
Really?
considered himself charismatic, not Pentecostal.
Okay.
So he was very much against that doctrine. I even heard him talk against it and denounce that
Hmm.
doctrine, which made me feel a little better about being there, but I didn't like being there because it was really into word faith, theology, prosperity gospel. Not so much Oral
Sure.
himself, but chapel speakers were.
Okay. So, did you meet Oral Roberts?
Not personally. I was in his
Okay.
presence, but I did not.
Okay.
I was glad he didn't know who I was because very often when he got to know people, it meant trouble for them. I'm talking about
Okay.
faculty members.
Sure.
You were not allowed to disagree with him, and I did in classes quite a bit
Okay.
about issues surrounding Pentecostal charismatic obsessions with miracles, which he was
Hmm.
obsessed with miracles. A miracle a day, he talked about, and things like that.
Hmm.
And he did make friends with and try to maintain friendships with the Hagans of Rhema Bible
Okay.
Institute, which was there
Yep.
in Tulsa, and Kenneth Copeland and people like that. And I just could not see that. I didn't
Hmm.
like that at all. Them being in chapel, Fred Price and other prosperity evangelists paraded through chapel. And so I was glad when I left. It was a dysfunctional place then. I think it's gotten much better since it's disconnected from the Roberts family, but I wouldn't
Okay.
go back.
Hmm.
I was not charismatic when I was at Oral Roberts University. I was Baptist. I belonged to an American Baptist congregation then. And the Baptist church I pastor twice a month is American Baptist. And that's kind of the
Okay.
denomination I joined when I left Pentecostalism. When I
Hmm.
came here to Colorado, I couldn't find an American Baptist church in our neighborhood, so I joined one very much like it, which is Mennonite, a modern Mennonite church. Anyway, back to the story.
Yes.
Changed my
Sorry.
mind. I wouldn't say it's a change as much as a evolution of being broader in some regards, narrower in other regards, um, perhaps firmer about orthodoxy,
Hmm.
and yet broader in my openness to different theologies, you might say.
What do you mean?
Open theism. I'm very much
Okay.
attracted to what is called open theism.
I was actually going to ask you about that. Was there a time when you and Greg Boyd and John Piper all taught at the same institution? Is that right?
When I got there at Bethel College in Minnesota, a Baptist college, Swedish Baptist, John Piper had just left.
Okay.
I met him, but I didn't really get to know him then. And that was in
Hmm.
1984. And he left,
Okay.
and I didn't take his place because he taught New Testament. But he had a degree, a doctoral degree from Munich, and I studied at Munich, so
Hmm.
we had that in common. But he left, and Greg Boyd came a couple years later, and Greg Boyd and I got to know each other, and we're still very good friends.
To my understanding, you defended, right, Greg Boyd when he was quite poorly treated, right, with regards to open theism. From what I've read, you never became one, or you were always kind of hesitant but generous towards open theism. How do you see that position now?
It's the same, but the thing is, it's a much deeper theological issue. Long ago, I came to begin to believe and then became solid in my belief that God is a very personal God. And that
Hmm.
means for me that God has a history. I agree with Jordan Peterson, who said in one of his most recent books that a person can only be described narratively. And if God is personal, then he has a narrative. And that's what the Bible is God's narrative that identifies God for us. Now, I won't say I don't believe that God changes in his being, but I do believe God changes in his experience with us
Hmm.
voluntarily, not because he has to. And there's where I differ from Hegel, even though I enjoy reading Hegel sometimes for about an hour and then I can't take it anymore. But God becoming, I definitely believe God becomes with us.
Okay.
And that inclines me toward open theism. I don't know how to resist it.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, I listened to your very good presentation, I think, on homebrewed Christianity, where you talked about your journey through kind of rejecting classical theism and this idea that God can change. And I think, did you say in there that God has self-actualized in the incarnation?
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
God has potential, and a potential in God was actualized in the incarnation.
Hmm.
I think it would have happened even if man had not sinned. But I did resist process theology, much to the host's dismay.
Yes, yes.
I have no attraction to process theology.
Sure. And I think Greg Boyd has done a good job of trying to show the key difference, right? Open theism is often accused of being just process theology.
And there is where the problem was at Bethel College, and I'm sure somewhat afterwards, but he was being accused of process theology, of
Hmm.
covertly being a process theologian. And I kind of knew more than suspected, and I still believe that some of his critics knew better than that, but were
Yeah.
continuing to frighten constituents by saying it. And one of them was the former dean of Bethel Seminary. And I knew him personally, and I was just absolutely shocked that he was
Hmm.
going around accusing Greg of process theology. And then I was at a theological conference at Beeson Divinity School, and there were about 500 people there. It was an evangelical conference. Timothy George was the convener, he was dean of the seminary there. And a leading evangelical theologian got up and said to the microphone that open theism is just process theology. So I stood up at the microphone in the aisle near where I was sitting and said, I'm sorry, but I have to correct you. It is not process theology. And he said, Olson, sit down.
Wow.
Well, he was a smart man. And I just could not believe that he didn't know the difference.
Hmm.
Because process theology does not believe in the omnipotence of God. Open theists do. And that's a huge difference.
I do have follow up questions, but I know your time is short, and I wanted to ask you about post conservative theology. I recently read your book, Reformed and Always Reforming: The Post Conservative Approach to Evangelical Theology, which is coming up on its 20th year anniversary. And I thought it was a very helpful book. But before I ask you a question about it, would you mind just briefly explaining what is a post conservative kind of attitude towards theology?
To put it very simply, much more could be said, but to put it very simply, post conservative evangelicals, first of all, are evangelicals, but we believe that in theological work, tradition gets a vote, but not a veto.
Hmm.
That what really matters is what the Bible says and what the Bible implies, and that fresh and faithful interpretation of the Bible, such as N.T. Wright does,
Mhm.
is still valid. So the constructive task of theology is not ever finished.
Hmm.
Whereas conservative evangelicals believe the only task of theology is to repeat and explain and to defend. For
Yeah.
example, they tend to be very much dependent on Charles Hodge, the great theologian of Princeton in the late 19th century. And one conservative evangelical theologian, David Wells at Gordon Conwell Seminary, wrote an article in Christianity Today called The Stout and Persistent Theology of Charles Hodge. And in it, he argued that since Charles Hodge's 3-volume systematic theology, nothing has been said or done in evangelical theology to add to it or
Hmm.
take anything away from it. And that's why I made my comment about Wayne Grudem earlier. It seems to me, and I could be wrong, I'm open to correction, but it seems to me that Wayne and many other conservative evangelical theologians are simply repeating, but in different language, of course,
Mhm.
things that Charles Hodge said in the 1870s and 1880s. It doesn't seem fresh to me.
I don't think you're wrong. I read most of that textbook. I was amazed that not once does he even reference Karl Barth.
I'm not.
But anyway, that's
Yeah.
another conversation. But one thing that I thought of when I was reading your book, Reformed and Always Reforming, is that it did kind of feel a bit dated, right? We mentioned Stan Grenz, and of course Clark Pinnock and James McClendon are also passed on. John Frank, Schultz, Sanders, these are names that aren't very familiar these days in terms of influence in evangelicalism. Maybe the only person that is still very influential is Kevin Van Hooser, but in some ways, I don't know if he still would be a post-conservative, maybe, maybe not. What kind of happened to that movement, or do you think there's anything left of it, and how might it be revived?
Well, let me pick up on what you said about Van Hooser. I don't know him personally, but when I read his book, The Drama of Doctrine, I did not see his proposal, his project, as being very different from Stan Grenz's. And
Hmm.
yet, I don't think he and Stan Grenz thought they agreed on much. And
Okay.
yet, fundamentally, I thought they were saying some of the same things.
Hmm.
But, it's kind of, I don't know how familiar you are with American evangelical politics, but a lot of what you can say and get away with saying depends on where you are and what circles you move in, what
Hmm.
institutional connections you have, etc. And Van Hooser has gone back and forth between Trinity and Wheaton, and I think he's off to somewhere else now. I haven't really kept track of him. But those two institutions are pretty conservative. And I don't think post conservative theology is welcome there at either one
Hmm.
of those, as far as I can tell. Whereas the seminary that I taught at for 22 years, Truett Seminary at Baylor University, and Baylor University in general, is more open to new
Hmm.
thinking, new ideas, and not as locked in to the evangelical magisterium of tradition.
Hmm.
Now, what happened to Stan Grenz is he died, and he was the leader of that movement,
Hmm.
and he's gone, and no one has stepped into his shoes to lead it.
Are you familiar with the Finnish theologian? He also teaches at Fuller, Veli Matti Karkkainen.
Yes, I know him.
Yeah, would some of his work kind of be this post-conservative kind of ethos, or what do you think?
He probably wouldn't accept that label. I don't know. I mean, there's been a lot of debate about the label itself, and a lot of people have
Sure.
resisted it because I think they've misunderstood it. But yes, I think from what I've read of Veli, he's one of what I would call a post conservative.
Hmm.
Two theologians, though, who accepted that label publicly are Richard Bauckham and N.T.
Okay. Yeah.
Wright.
Hmm.
So I'm proud of that.
Yes. Both New Testament scholars, right?
Bauckham told me to my face when he came to Truett that he is one of my post conservative evangelicals. And
Yeah.
N.T. Wright put it in his book Justification that he is.
Okay.
Yes, they're New Testament scholars, but they do theology.
Sure, sure. Especially Bauckham, right?
Oh,
He's written a
yeah.
book on Moltmann, I think.
And other things, yeah.
One thing that I have been not confused by your work, but something I'd like some clarity on is how you're very unique. Even I'm sure people listening to this will recognize that you're not fully convinced by mainstream kind of American evangelicalism. You wrote a great little book called How to Be Evangelical Without Being Conservative. Yes.
That's right.
So yeah, which is very different, right? And I think even in a other interview I listened to, you said that American evangelicals are, quote, often cranky, mean-spirited, overly political, and divisive, end
Ah,
quote.
yes.
So I guess my question is why bother still holding on to this label of evangelical? Why not just leave it behind and be a Orthodox Christian in the great tradition, you know?
Well, Orthodox means so many different things to so many different people. I guess you could say evangelical does too, but I think it's more specific. All of my career, I've promoted, defended, and explained what evangelical really means. And to me, you can't just make it mean whatever you want it to mean.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was younger here in America, there was a big divide between evangelicals and fundamentalists. Now, we believed many of the same things. And evangelicals would often say behind their hands, those fundamentalists are evangelicals, but they're cranky, mean, angry evangelicals, and we're not that.
Hmm.
But then something happened, and those cranky, mean, angry fundamentalists became a dominant group within American evangelicalism.
Mm-hmm.
And when I first noticed that, I was shocked and dismayed. Jerry Falwell, for example, in the 60s and 70s, did not call himself an evangelical. He called himself a fundamentalist. He published a magazine called The Fundamentalist, and he was extremely critical of Billy Graham.
Hmm.
Then in the 1970s into the 1980s, he began to promote himself as sort of the spokesman for American evangelicalism, but without really changing his theology and his demeanor. And
Okay. Yeah.
I noticed that, and I had to really think, what shall I do? Shall I give up the term? I'm not going to give it up. Evangelical, that's my label. That's what I am. I'm not going to let them
Hmm.
take it away from me.
Yeah, I noticed in the book, The Spectrum of Evangelicalism, one of those 4 or 5 view books that you contributed to. So often, Al Mohler, who was representing conservative evangelicals, sounded very similar to the fundamentalist contributor. And actually, they agreed on most things, which was kind of surprising.
Okay, so there's a story about that book. Once it came out and we all read each other's, well, before it was published, we all read each other's chapters. And John Stackhouse and I agreed that there's really only 2 views in that book.
Hmm.
His and mine on one hand, though I'm not saying we think exactly alike. Where 2 think alike, 1 is superfluous. We don't
Sure.
want that. But there's our view, and then there's the other 2. The other 2 people who have one view and share it. I forgot the other
Hmm.
one's name besides Mohler. Can't remember his name, but he teaches at a fundamentalist Baptist seminary in Minneapolis, as I recall.
Yes.
So I think there's only 2 views in that book.
Yes, I think so too. Lastly, what are you working on these days? I know you, yeah, do you have any more books?
So I have a book coming out from InterVarsity Press later this year or early next year called Christian Theology, Thinking About the Faith. Now, I have
Okay.
to say that's not the title I wanted it to have, but publishers choose titles, authors don't.
Sure.
And I wanted it to be titled Christian Theology, Classic and Contemporary.
Hmm.
And it's a book about theology. It could be seen, I suppose, as a systematic theology, though I don't think it's very systematic. You might call that my summa, I don't know. Depends on how many more years God gives me. But it's
Sure.
in the process. It's in the pipeline
Okay.
toward publication.
I look forward to getting a hold of it.
I'm working on a book about Hegel and theology, as I mentioned earlier.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, that'll be interesting.
Good talking to you.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Olson. Yeah, it's great to meet you finally. As I say, I've been skimming your blog for almost 10 years now, so it's
Oh,
great to
great.
meet you. If you're still listening, I'm touched. Thank you. Will you do me a favor? Just about nobody in the entire world knows about this podcast. Would you mind sharing it with one person you think will disagree with it? Or agree? It's up to you. See you next time on Be Spectacled and Curious. I'm Jonathan Tizick, signing off.